There we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is someone else's Sandbox panel. My name is Zoraida Córdova. I'm the author of the Brooklyn Bruja series, and I've also written for worlds like Star Wars. And I would love, before we get into what someone else's Sandbox is, I'd love for all the panelists to introduce themselves and the worlds that they write in. Daniel.
Oh, hey. I'm Daniel José Older. I write the Shadow Shaper Cipher, the Dactyl Hill Squad series, and the Book of Lost Saints, and the upcoming sci-fi kids book, Flood City. But in terms of other people's sandboxes, I write for Star Wars.
Kiersten.
Hi, I'm Kiersten White. I wrote the Anti-Darken trilogy, the Paranormalcy trilogy, bunch of other books, including The Dark Son of Elizabeth Frankenstein, which is a retelling of Frankenstein. My most recent, The Camelot Betrayal, which is the second book in the Camelot Rising trilogy, which is a King Arthur retelling. Also, most recently, with my friends Zoraida and Daniel, from a certain point of view, Empire Strikes Back, which was my first playing in Star Wars, and then of course the Slayer duology, which is set in the world of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Amazing. Christian?
Hi, I'm FCE. I am the author of the Jeannie Lo novels, The Epic Crush of Jeannie Lo and The Iron Will of Jeannie Lo. And I'm also the author for the prose novels for Avatar, The Last Airbender, The Rise of Kyoshi, and The Shadow of Kyoshi.
Awesome. And last but not least,
Phoebe.
Hey.
Was trying to make herself known. I write all kinds of things in terms of IP. I've written DC Comics Lois Lane, which I wrote a trilogy about, which was great fun. And I wrote the first official Stranger Things novel, Suspicious Minds, which was also great fun, which is prequel to the show. And I'm also involved in kind of a weirder IP, which I know Zoraida's going to define what that means. But I just joined a shared world consortium that George R. Martin runs called Wild Cards. That's been around for several decades. And it's creator owned. So all of the people who write stories for it own the property together. It's like its own superhero universe. So that's me. And then I write my own books. My next thing start next year, which is a rom-com fantasy duology set at the sort of end of the world. From St. Martin's. And yeah, I'm not going to bug you with the title because it's not even up for pre-order yet.
Well, I mean, so I've always been fascinated with the world of IP, which when we talk about that, we talk about intellectual property. And what intellectual property just means is that it's somebody else's idea. For instance, Disney exists. There are authors who write for Disney books, specifically those fairy tale princess retellings. And it was then that I realized that Disney owns the character of Maleficent and like they created her. So like if I were to do just a regular fairy tale retelling, I can't use that character in Sleeping Beauty. So that's intellectual property. If I worked for, Disney, I could probably ask for that. But so how did you guys get into like picking these worlds? Did you ask your agent to pitch you? Did somebody approach you? I feel like this question is one that readers ask me all the time. Like, how did you get the Star War? And yeah, so I don't know who wants to start. I'll start the reverse way. Gwenda.
I always feel like I hate myself when I answer this question because it actually the two IP projects I've done were just completely the editor came to my agent and me and asked if I wanted to do them. And they came together very quickly. But, I have published several books already, which I think is something that when people ask us this question, they kind of miss that you don't usually just jump into doing like a high level IP. Although it happens, it's very rare. So, for me, I was just lucky to be asked and to really feel like I could add something to these particular universes. That really is an important thing.
Yeah. Christian?
Similar story, sheer luck. On one hand, it was definitely a case where my editors and publishers pitched me the project, and I couldn't believe that something like that could just fall into my lap. So eternally grateful on that point. But to emphasize what Gwenda said, like, yeah, they wouldn't. And if you're asking, like, how does somebody even get that lucky in the first place and get to the table, you have to actually finish your own projects first. It's very unlikely that you would get a chance like that without having established your own work to some degree.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that that's one of the things that readers ask me the most. And I like to sort of demystify the process, right? This is YALLWrite. So, how do we demystify the publishing and writing process to say we're just humble authors wanting to write in our favorite universes? What about you, Kiersten?
Yeah, pretty similar, and like both Gwenda and Christian, I've written many books. One of the requirements for writing IP is generally it's a much tighter turnaround time, right? It's a tighter schedule, and so you have to not only establish that you know how to write a book or write a series, you also have to be able to write on a really strict timeline. So for Slayer, I joke I'm probably the only person who's ever gotten a book deal off of a T-shirt. Many years ago, I was at Comic-Con promoting my very first trilogy, and I was wearing a Sunnydale High School T-shirt, as one does at Comic-Con, or just every day. And I met my friend Shannon Messenger's editor, Lisa Abrams, and she's like, "Oh, you like Buffy?" And I was like, "Of course I like Buffy. I'm sane." And so we just had this conversation about Buffy and kind of kept in contact over the years, just very casually as friends. And so then when Lisa Abrams got the rights to do a YA Buffy spinoff, because she knew that, I write similar things, I write quickly, and she already knew I was a huge Buffy fan, I was the first person that she thought of. And so I'm a really big proponent of putting the things that you love out there, because you never know. You never know who's listening. You never know who's going to pick up on, or when they get a project like Slayer and they're going to say, "Oh, we know Kiersten loves Buffy. Let's ask her first." Sorry, literally every other YA author out there. It was always fun.
What about you, Daniel?
Similar story. I think my origin story in Star Wars actually goes back 4 years ago, almost to the day, because I was at the Surrey International Writers Conference in Vancouver, sitting next to Delilah Dawson, who's awesome, and wrote the Phasma book. And at that point, the Phasma book wasn't out, but she had a novella out with Star Wars. And she was the first. I don't think I'd met Chuck at that point yet, or I knew him online probably, but either way, Delilah was like the first conversation I had with a writer that I knew personally, who was like, "Yeah, I write Star Wars books." And I was like, "That sounds like a great idea." That sounds like honestly, like, my idea of IP was like, when we were growing up, IP didn't look like it does now. You know what I mean? It was like
Totally
different.
true.
I don't know how to describe it. It just wasn't, and I do credit Star Wars a lot with really being awesome about voice and letting us really be ourselves and be part of the universe, and not try to like get us to be like just like a standard whatever kind of the same old voice. And talking to Delilah and then whatever, all this, I was just like, oh, this guy could really like do something really fun with this like these characters that I've had in my brain since I was 3 years old. So I told my agent, like, put the word out, and I think he did. I don't know, I didn't follow up, but I know at some point they came to me about from a certain point of view, the first one, and were like, "Would you like to write a story?" And I immediately was like, curses and everything. I'm glad my agent didn't forward the email that I sent to him back, because there were so many F-bombs in it.
I mean,
You know,
I'm sure they would have
like,
appreciated it.
yeah, I know, right?
Margie
and then
Margie Stoll says that her response when they asked her to write Black Widow was, "I'll do it for free," and her agent's like,
Yeah. Don't
No,
say
you
that.
won't.
The funny part is,
Mine was I would do it for a sandwich.
like, because a certain point of view, anthology is a charity anthology. We all did that for free. And it was
Yes,
worth it.
that's true.
right.
And I definitely was like, tell them I want to do a novel. So
Tell them I would do one for money also.
Yeah.
if you want to pay me, I'll do this even more.
Uh,
worked.
it did work. And I do, so like what Kiersten said really resonates with me, because I didn't even think that, like, now more people put that stuff out on Twitter, like, I would like somebody let me write X, Y, Z. Whereas I was just sort of, I didn't think that would happen to me. And this is my origin story, where I was like, oh, I want to write a novel where Poe Dameron's just being like, what's a PG-13 word? Um, he's being charming all over the galaxy, right? And then literally the next day I get this message from my agent saying like, hey, do you want to be part of this anthology? Like, they heard you were a fan. And I was like, whoa, was it Twitter?
Whoa.
Did something good come from Twitter? That's amazing. I still have not verified whether that is true, but I'll just make it my own personal canon. And so like that brings me to how much of yourself goes into these books, right? When I feel like Daniel said something really amazing, which was IP looked different back in the day, but now it's sort of like you're bringing your own voice. So how much of yourself goes into, can somebody recognize, like I feel when somebody reads A Crash of Fate, they can say this is a Zoraida book, as well as the Brooklyn Bruja series, right? Like you can hear me. But I don't know how everyone else feels about that writing process. Daniel?
I feel like there's a sweet spot. There's a balance that you're trying to find, right? So it's like that's exactly what you said, is that you want, like with Last Shot, like a lot of people are like, you nailed the voices, and that's what I was trying to do. And I was like, that's because I've been living them, like I said, since I was 3, so that wasn't really an issue. But also, it's still hard to do. And then it's also like, yes, can you also put your stamp on it, but not in an egotistical way, like this is a Daniel book, ha, gotcha. But like, this is what I've always known to be Star Wars. This is also has things in it that I wish I'd seen more of in Star Wars, but didn't. Like that's sort of your moment to shine. And then I think like rhythmically, like voice has so much to do with rhythm to me, and just trying to think of like how that can what does a space fight sound and feel like when there's like mambo constantly playing in your head or wawanko, you know what I mean? Like we haven't really gotten to see enough of that yet. We're starting to now, that the world of Star Wars is changing behind the scenes too, and so that was really what I wanted to bring.
Awesome. Kiersten?
Yeah, so specifically with Slayer, it was very, very open-ended. When they presented it to me, they said, new story set in the Buffyverse. We want it to be about a new Slayer set after the events of season 7 of Buffy. And that was really all the upfront guidance that they gave. And so for me, it was a matter of finding a story that I was engaged in, that I wanted to tell, while also making it feel like it had always been a part of the Buffyverse, right? Because Buffy's not the main character. None of the main characters from the show are main characters or even necessarily characters in this series. And so for me, it was finding that balance between, creating new characters, but also fitting into the tone of the Buffyverse, which was actually pretty easy because Buffy was such a formative story for me. And it was so formative on the way that I view stories and the way that I tell stories, and the combination of horror and humor and the super high emotional stakes alongside the super high, like supernatural stakes, all the stakes. It's a Slayer story. It was a pretty natural fit. And like my entire goal with it was that when people read it, they feel the same way they felt when they were watching Buffy. Whether or not I was successful, I hope that I was. But yeah, it was finding that marriage between a story that I wanted to tell while still also participating in those others. And that's always the challenge with IP, right? Because it is you. They hired you for a reason, right? For what you could bring to the story. But at the same time, you're respectful of the source material. You know that what you're telling is part of a bigger whole. And so it has to also work that way. And as a creator, I find it a really fascinating, really invigorating challenge. Like I really enjoy that aspect of it.
Awesome. Christian?
Yeah, like I wonder if there's something to do with either the longevity of the franchises that we end up writing for, or the kind of like embracement of fandom and nerddom that just everyone has these days. Where I think it's pretty evident from everyone here. It's like we consider like IP is the prize, right? Like it's like finally like everything's paid off, and this is the reward at the end of the journey. And I think there to that extent, if you develop as a fan to a franchise, like you're going to end up putting that voice and that love into the IP that you work for. That's probably the thing that adds to the enjoyment and the incremental value of your work into that franchise. Like that passion is going to end up being there. It has to be there. And if you think about it, all the franchises, even in their earliest incarnations, it's somebody putting themselves into it. No matter who's adding to a story, they're always going to have to put some of themselves into it. Fans will very easily detect when no one has put their heart into an addition to IP. So yeah, you might as well embrace that part of yourself.
Yeah, I love that.
I feel like I should say, by the way, that I'm not smoking. That looked like there was smoke. It's actually fur from Piggy. And like, I have no idea that when she's like her fluff is going everywhere, it looked a little like smoke there at the beginning. So there's no smoking going on here.
It's fine. Usually when I'm on panels, there's smoke, and it's like my incense.
At the end of this, I will go pull up my Buffy steak from the last season set and brandish it at you, Kiersten, that a friend of mine stole who was interning on the lot. And said,
Amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, this is a real friend. To me, what I'm starting to, when I get approached about an IP project, first off, I have to almost immediately generate a story. Like it has to be something that I connect with so strongly that like immediately my brain is filling in like the ways that I would rate it. If that doesn't happen, I know I'm not the person for it. And so I always start by asking like 3 or 4 questions of what are like the 3 or 4 elements of this property or universe that without them, it's not going to feel like a story in that universe. Those are the non-negotiables that your voice can't displace, that readers and fans will be upset if they're not there because it won't feel right. So I think once you figure out what those non-negotiable things are, it's like, well, then you can play on top of that. And, like for Stranger Things, I really knew I wanted to do a girl group because that's something that the friendship group is core to the story, but we haven't really seen like a friendship girl group. And that was always something that frustrated me about Boys on Bikes is it's like, why can't we have girls on bikes? Which they're, we just don't see as much in pop culture. And so it's really important to me that be a centerpiece and then like that the period be represented. And so the same thing for Lois and Superman. I'm never going to be one of those people who's like, how can I make Lois and Superman dark? Because no one wants that. Who's a fan of them? I'm a fan of them, and that's not who those characters are. Sorry, Zack Snyder and his fans who will now come attack me on Twitter as soon as this panel is over. Y'all. But at any rate, that's kind of where it lands for me is like, can I add my voice to this without it breaking kind of the property? Because you do have to write it like any book that you would write. And in some cases, you have to write it so much faster that you have to love property, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Shenanigans, right?
Yeah, there's a question that we have from the audience. Josh wants to know sort of what actually goes into the elements of franchise and IP work as far as like keeping it close to our own books, which we've talked a little bit about. But Josh specifically is asking about what kind of research they give us. And honestly, I think that this could go either way because I'm the kind of person where I'm like, I'm going to write a book about mermaids, and so I'm gonna buy every single mermaid book that has ever existed, and then that's my research, right? I wrote Boba Fett for the new anthology, the Empire Strikes Back anthology, and I dug up every single reference to Boba Fett in the Star Wars canon and no longer canon. So just to know, just to understand what came before. But that's how my process works. How does everyone else's process works when it comes to research and writing these big worlds? And anyone can start. So I don't know. I feel like a teacher now calling on people.
I'll jump in. I wanted to also shout out something that Gwenda said, because saying no is such an important thing, especially now in the midst of just everything going on and burnout being real. And especially with something that isn't like high value as IP, like it's still important to be able to make very clear and sometimes very difficult decisions and say no, even when it's a property we might love. Sometimes it's the money, sometimes it's the time, sometimes it's not your lane. there's a lot of reasons to say no, and it sometimes it's scary going up to it and feels amazing when you've done it. But I just want to shout out saying no, in part to come back to the question, because it is very rigorous. Like, it is very time consuming. When I wrote Last Shot, I was also writing Dactyl Hill Squad, my Civil War series, and the amount of research was about the same. So I was reading like all these Civil War books, and I was on the Wikipedia 24/7, just randomly open, like, which I love. Like, I don't even think you're supposed to say that that's an official source, but it's so helpful and amazing. And and then I would jump to the Wikipedia and read up on battles, which I would then follow up on in actual books too. And it's very in depth, but especially a world like Star Wars is huge. It's bigger than anyone can fit in their brain except Pablo Hidalgo. And you just have to like jump in, and it's like any research for if you were writing historical fantasy, it's a similar level of intensity.
Yeah. I had something similar when I was writing Slayer, because I have 7 seasons of a television show, but then there are also several seasons of canonical graphic novels. And so I had the television show, I had the comics. So I would be watching, I was working through the television show, also watching key episodes, also watching like YouTube supercuts of every scene of dialogue between these two characters. Thank you,
Wow.
people on YouTube who have nothing better to do. You are genuine public servants. And then I would also have like the graphic novels, and then the Watcher's Guide and the Buffy Guide to Demons out. And so my husband would come home from a long day of being a lawyer, and I would have my laptop on my lap watching the YouTube supercut of all the kisses between Buffy and Angel, which maybe wasn't relevant to my book, but it could have been. And then
It's
like
definitely relevant to my life.
Yes, right? But I'd be like, oh yes, I also am working, doing my important job. So yeah, like it's fun because it feels like play, but it's also really serious research, right? Because I take the job seriously. I take the fandom seriously. Buffy was hugely important to me and still is. And so it was really, really important to me to get it right. And so it did require a tremendous amount of research. I will say the most challenging part of writing my short story from a certain point of view, Empire Strikes Back, was finding a random combination of syllables that has not been used as a name in the Star Wars universe. It took me 2 hours. 2 hours to come up with 4 names.
Several of our Star Wars, just ask. They'll be like, can you get Christopher to come up with a Star Wars name that has not been used? And he can just rattle off a couple. He's like really good at it.
I know. I started random like syllables to Wikipedia, and it would always bring something up every single time. And I was like, how is that also a name? But
yeah. That's why Zoraida is an actual Star Wars character now, because I was looking for a name, and I was like, you know what? I think Zoraida's got a Star Wars story or book coming out soon. Let me put her in there. I think Mon Calamari.
I am a Mon Calamari. I love it.
Right?
Mon Calamari are the best.
Yeah. They wear sweaters, we recently found out.
It makes sense. It makes perfect sense.
Absolutely.
So good.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
when you put their names in canon for them. It's weird because Lois Lane's one of the longest characters in DC history, right? She's been around for almost 80 years, maybe 80 years now. I don't talk that much about her anymore, so I'd have to do the math. But she had Superman 1938. Someone who's good at math can do that. But honestly, like, there was not a whole lot about teen Lois Lane, so there was quite a bit of room for me to invent based on the adult depictions of the character. So in that way, it was really freeing. And similar with Stranger Things, like, Eleven's mom is the center of my book, and there's not a whole lot of her in the series, although she's a pivotal character. And I actually still think it's tremendously cool that the Duffers chose to make her the first character, the center of the first expanded universe kind of a book in that world, because she could so easily just be the tragic mother figure, right, that we never get to know. So I really looked at like those very little things that we have is like we see her as a huge fighter. And I had to do a ton of research, not so much on Stranger Things, which they did give me a lot of information about, but about 1969. because like the periods that those are set in is such a huge thing. You're writing about a college kid in 1969 going through real experiments. MK Ultra was real. So I had to do all this research on the real experiments of MK Ultra and then on every period detail, right? Like they have a set designer to make sure that the carpeting is right. I had to do that myself. I don't know if you guys know this about people who grew up in the 1960s, but they really fetishize their childhood. And so it's all online. Like anything you could ever need to know, there's a website about the candies that were, briefly lived for 2 months in whatever year. And, when decaf coffee was invented, like all of that stuff was online. But I did feel like it all had to be checked because, as you guys know, like you trust your copy editors and stuff, but the production schedule on books like this is so fast. You want to do as much of it as you can to make it as easy on the as possible on your editor and copy editor.
Yeah, it is. It's such a truncated period of time, and the schedule is something that we could have another panel on that, I think. What about you? What kind of research did you do on something like Kyoshi?
Well, Gwenda brings up a really good point where you look at you definitely do the research. You look at the materials that have been supplied, but then when you're trying to fill in gaps when you haven't seen a whole bunch of either a historical period or characters develop onto that point, then you kind of have to look at almost like I don't know, like maybe I'm just making up a word, but like sort of like narrative research where you have to try to figure out how somebody could have gotten or how the world could have gotten to the point that where you do see in a way that sort of makes sense. So there's not a whole lot to research on Kyoshi in the book, but if you think about like how does somebody arrive to become the type of person who like rolls up, manifests in the reincarnation just to say, yeah, I killed that dude, and then pieces out. Or how does somebody end up being the type of person to say to a 12-year-old monk, like, sorry kid, you got to do what you got to do. so 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 there's a bit of like, I guess, like mental research and world building of like, okay, what did the circumstances look like that could generate that kind of moment of that which you do have access to. So I figured, okay, that she's probably seen some stuff and probably has changed quite a bit from she probably wasn't like that her entire time. So there's that type of, so even if you don't have a whole timeline to research through, you can kind of try to like reconstruct one in your head to a certain extent.
Okay, very cool. So actually, while I have you, several people really want to know what your experience to further writing in this world and Kyoshi's, what your personal experience is the actual question.
But what the personal experience was writing the world, it did involve trying to look at a lot of history. History was brought up as a really good reference point. That's always going to be fuel for thought and inspiration. So trying to look at, so a lot of doing a lot of historical study and trying to see like, wow, how messed up can people make things for themselves. There's a huge library of that unavailable to you. So borrowing from there uh, was a large part of the experience of writing in that universe, because I think one of the good things about every universe that we've all mentioned here is that there's always that sense of history. Like there's a past and you're catching a glimpse of the world in motion. So uh, drawing from the world in motion at previous stages is always just a good area to get inspiration from.
Yeah.
That's a great.
Uh,
That's a
a lot of
great frame. Yeah, the world in motion, stealing that.
Yeah. A lot of people are really curious to know in the comments about when we say a tighter deadline, can you give an example on how tight / how fast do they expect a completed MS manuscript for an IP? And I do want to point out that there are two different kinds of IP. There are established worlds like Star Wars, and then there are things like a publisher decides we would like that they want to do their own in-house creative property, and then they match an author to develop it. So there are two kinds. And I have found that the timelines differ for something that's already established versus something that you have to sort of create from the ground up. So if anybody wants to talk about deadlines that they feel like they're able to, go ahead.
I think the average is maybe like 3 months or 4 months. From what
What? Daniel,
Sometimes,
I had, I think, less than 3 months to write my book.
Average, I said. Average.
Yeah.
I think there's people that have gotten longer, and there's definitely people that have gotten shorter, clearly. I don't remember what my turnaround was for Last Shot. And with the High Republic, like the whole idea of that in part was to like get ahead of things and not have to make writers like break our backs to turn around things in 3 months. We'll see how that pans out. But, 3 months is average. Yeah.
I think it also depends, though, active property versus passive property. So, for example, if you're doing a Star Wars novel that ties into the movie that's coming out this year, of course, they're going to want it to come out at the same time so they can capitalize on that. Whereas with Slayer, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is no longer airing. It's sort of more of a passive property. So I think I had like normal deadlines for this. I think that actually the tightest deadline I ever had was for The Dark Son of Elizabeth Frankenstein, which isn't IP, but it was one where my editor approached me and was like, hey, it's the 200th anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein next year. Do you want to write a Frankenstein retelling? If so, we would need a draft in like 3 months. And I was like, of course I want to write a Frankenstein retelling.
Of course you want it in 3 months.
Of course. So yeah, I mean, I wrote it in like a week, but whatever. And so, yeah, I think a lot of it is tied to whether they're trying to promote a book alongside something else that is releasing, and so your deadlines are very, very tight and very firm, or it's just participating in an existing property, in which case you're probably going to have more traditional book publication.
I don't know. I think that's sort of true, but like for me personally hasn't been. So like the Lois Lane book, I was kind of a low kid on the totem pole. Like I only had a book or two out from an imprint that like went under, and I still don't know how I got chosen for that gig. Like it's still a miracle. And then my most successful book came out afterwards, So I had, I think, a month and a half at most to write the first draft. And I've talked to Jason Reynolds had said much the same thing about Miles Morales. But then once we turned them in and they're like, oh, these are good, these might do well. Like when we had more time to do revision and for, because we've been on a similar panel like this, but like at the time we both were just like, oh God, I've never written a book this fast. I remember sitting in the car on the way to Christmas dinner, writing on my Alpha Smart Neo, that first book. And then my editor was like, have you thought about changing it to first person after I turned it in? So, that was I loved my editor in that whole process. And they totally let me do what I wanted to do. But that first time, I really felt like I had to prove that I could turn it in quickly. And then for Stranger Things, we did bump the book from when it was originally going to be. But when it came down to the everyone's on board, this is what we're writing, I think I had a month again, and then like I had a week to turn around the edits. So I was broken after that, a shell of myself for a couple of months. But it did sort of teach me my limits of what I can do, and it taught me a new process, which involves basically making a giant crazy murder board on the wall of my office of every scene, so that I write that. Because it was difficult, but. I don't recommend trying that at home with your own work for no reason at all. But for the second book in the Lois Lane, I had like 6 months. I had like a normal period for the second and third books, and that was luxurious.
It's funny because sometimes, I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes a tight deadline can almost like sharpen your skills or put them into focus. Because the thing is, like what we've been talking about, how it's good to have experience before you approach an IP. It's because it's kind of like the way they talk about pro chess players. They chunk things. They can think about a big, huge project that could be really chaotic, but they know how to mentally at least organize it into structures that they can work with, and then start chewing through really quickly. They don't remember the whole game from start to finish. They remember the beginning, middle, and the end game. So it's often sometimes the deadline is a chance to exercise that function and even to get better at it. And sometimes it can actually help. Sometimes it can help you with your craft in the sense that like it can teach you what will work and what won't work under the gun. Like I remember one of the biggest lessons that I ever drove home from me was like the relationship between plot and characterization, where I was trying to I was butting up against against my deadline, and a bit of characterization wasn't working, and then I realized it's because I didn't have the actual plot structures necessary to support the characterization. So I ended up scrapping like 40% of the book and just rewriting it again. And while like sure that stinks and that's wasted work, it really drives home good advice in general, whether it's IP or your own work, whether you have a month or whether you have years, is like, wow, you actually have to really think about the link between your plot and characterization for best results. And that like, well, now I'm never gonna forget that because because of how stressed I was. I'll take that tip to my grave.
Did you guys outline before you did IP? Were you outliners, or do you outline your original stuff now? I'm sorry, I've turned into Lois Lane as I tend to do.
I've always. Oh, go ahead.
We've had this conversation, you and I, Daniel Jose Older, because I talked about I do outline because it keeps me structured. Also, I made a really big mistake in my first trilogy with like a continuity error because I did not outline, and Daniel was like, "It's like I don't want to know what I eat," or I forgot the metaphor that she used, but I was like, Daniel Jose Older.
Not my full name. Not my government on the panel. I have always.
Have you changed your mind?
I have changed my mind. I'm here to repent. I have always hated outlines. I wrote the first literally like 15 books of my career without outlines, and I enjoyed the hell out of it. And I would do it again. And I was kind of mortified when Star Wars was like, "Great, turn in your outline." And I was like, "No!" And then when I went to Lucasfilm to like tell them my outline or to actually talk through it with them, they were supposed to have read it, and they were like, "So we didn't get a chance to read it. Just tell it to us." And I was like, "No!" But they're great, by the way. That's not a slam on them. I wouldn't have read it either if I was a storykeeper. But I made it vague enough that I could still enjoy the process. And then I totally changed it. But I since have fallen in love with outlining on the book I'm working on now, and I have changed my evil ways.
I love it. Okay. If you guys have more to add, I just want to say we're at the 5-minute mark. I'm getting the notifications. So, anybody else outline? Yes, no? Team outline?
I had to write a pitch for Slayer, saying basically like, this is the story that I want to write to get it approved by the powers that be. And so I wrote the pitch and I turned it in and it got approved. And then I wrote a totally different book.
That's what I'm talking about.
But it was bad. And so my editor was like, I'm not really sure why you made these choices. We really liked that pitch. And you kind of just like didn't write that pitch at all. You don't know what to do with this. And in her defense, it was a bad book. There was so much pressure and I absolutely choked. But having done the worst possible case scenario, did it, check, failed, then I was like, okay, you're right. Let's go back to the pitch. So I went back to the pitch and I wrote the book that I told them I was going to write to begin with, and they liked it. So yeah, I'm not typically an outliner, but I do like to have the shape of the book before I start. So writing a pitch isn't like it's not that bad.
Right.
Yeah. While I have you.
Oh, sorry. My number one tip for this is do an outline, and on those days when you're sucking, like trust the outline. Like that is the key to working fast. Like
that's true.
Trust the outline.
Yeah. If anybody is curious about outlining in the audience, there's a book called 2000 to 10,000 by or now that it's NaNoWriMo. It's called 2000 to 10,000 by Rachel Aaron, and it's really good, like the productivity triangle and how to write more words in a day. And I really love it. But I have a question in the audience for Kiersten, which is there are so many books on Arthurian legend. So how many have you read? How do you balance creating something new?
Okay, so that's the reference to the Gwenda reception of the Camelot Betrayal. And honestly, writing retellings is not that different from writing IP, right? Because you're participating in an existing storytelling tradition or you're building on existing stories. So with Arthurian legend, the cool thing about Arthurian legend is that it has literally always been fan fiction from day one. There is no such thing as Arthurian canon. It was some dude saw some record of a 5th century battle in Wales, and there was a king mentioned named Arthur, and they're like, cool name, bro. I want to write a poem about you. So they made up a poem about this king, and then somebody read that poem, and they were like, that was a dope poem. I'm going to write a poem using those same characters, but adding something. And so it really was just like this game of, oh, I love what you did there. What about Lancelot? Or, oh, I love what you did there. What if we had brothers named Yvain and Yvain, but one of them has a lion? And like it just goes and goes and goes and goes. And so you have these super messy family trees because nothing is ever consistent because there's no canon, right? And so writing, because I have written really, really faithful retellings with the Anti-Dark and Historical or The Dark Son of Elizabeth Frankenstein, which is very, very faithful to the original Frankenstein, it was really freeing for this one to just get to say, I'm going to take the archetypes of the characters and the things that I love about Arthurian myth and add in the things that I hate about Arthurian myth and change it. And I think that really relates to working in IP too, right? Because you're attracted to it because of the things that you love. And the most exciting thing about writing in these worlds and these universes that you love is you then get to add the things that make it even more what you love, or the things that you haven't seen there but you want to see. You get to add that and you get to create that and you get to expand the universe both for yourself and for your readers who maybe haven't seen that type of story told. So for the Arthurian retelling, I really just went archetypes. I didn't feel like I had to read every single Arthurian thing that's ever been done because there's too many and none of it's canon.
Yeah.
So my
Right.
version is just as valid as the 5th century poem about some, dude king who fought in Wales. Like, it's all just stories.
The Dude
It's all
King.
just I love it. Dude King. Oh my God, new novel.
That's
I
a
love it
pitch
so
right
much.
there.
Copyright.
Oh my God. Okay, so this is not my final question, but I want you to think on my final question, which is, what world would you write in? A lot of that's been a recurring question. Like, what world would you write in? Aside from the ones that you have written in. So that's going to be my final question. My pre-final question is, I just lost it. Jennifer would like to know, working on public domain stories, what is your advice or lesson or cautionary tale or even encouragement that you would offer readers, writers who may want to pursue this in their own careers?
I have one cautionary tale that immediately comes to mind, which is Megan Shepherd, who's talked about this publicly. Her first series was based on Dr. Moreau, yes, and those books. And it turned out they were in the public domain here, but not in the UK. And so she had to pay a chunk of money to the estate in the UK to publish them there. So make sure, like I went to get my Buffy steak.
Oh, nice.
Make sure that your public domain is good everywhere.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's a big cautionary tale. My cautionary tale, I would say, make sure you have an agent before you enter any sort of contract with an existing domain. Make sure you have an agent before you sign any contract, period, because you don't know what you're giving up. You don't know if possibly you create a character that is going to be further used. This is not from experience, but this is from watching other people go through this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that it really brings up, both IP and public domain stuff, is like the skill of fluidity as a writer is especially important. Like even when we're writing our own stories, we have to kind of move with the story and then bring our own piece, and it's always a conversation, right? But that is times 10 when you're playing with others, right? Like when you're working with characters that other people are going to build off, and it requires like an ability to just go in and like chill a little bit, which is really hard. It's really hard because you get really attached, and you should. And also, you have to let go and release in a totally different way than when it's your stuff. By the way, do you like this beautiful sunset I've orchestrated?
You look beautiful. You look beautiful.
Is that a special ring light that you have? And like,
Anybody else before we get to our last question?
Yeah.
No? Okay, cool. So what would you pick? What would be your final thing? Like, I would want to write in Supernatural. Like, I want to continue Supernatural, but that's just me.
You know, honestly,
I want to know.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I want to know. I want to know how to get into Star Wars, man. I've got this is the best group to. This is the best group to ask.
Christian, just tell your agent to pitch you.
Yeah.
I've made this joke many times in the past, but the thing is, like, George Lucas says Star Wars isn't about spaceships, it's about family. Like, no, I want it's about spaceships. I want to write about spaceships in Star Wars.
Yeah, it's really about both.
I hope I get to work on another IP, and I look forward to like figuring out what it is. The only one that I can come up with is completely ridiculous and will never happen, which would be a reboot of the Snake Plissken Escape from New York universe. a female outlaw who's claiming to be Snake Plissken's daughter, and then encounters another Snake Plissken's daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my god, I want that so much. I want that book so badly.
I want to write original YA Pokemon novels. I actually hunted down the person at Scholastic who works with Pokemon and the parent company. Unfortunately / fortunately, they're very, very protective of the property, which I appreciate. But I'm still going to put it out there forever. Original Pokemon YA novels. I want them.
Kirsten, if it was up to me, I would choose you.
Which I think would be great. I remember you tweeting about it.
Awesome. Daniel, last one where they're telling us to wrap up.
Probably since I'm reading it, I'm watching it right now, Black Sails, because it's the best show ever, and it's itself IP, basically fan fiction of Treasure Island, which is so cool. And I love pirates because I am one, and so Black Sails. Shoot.
You are a pirate, space pirate. Thank you guys so much. Thank you everybody for watching. And we will see you next time.